Hello and welcome to another Bible study on the book of Esther. I'm glad that you are with us today. It's cold outside, so I've decided to come inside for this study as we continue this exciting drama that is unfolding in the book of Esther. Today we're looking at chapters 5, chapter 6, and chapters 7. One programming note. Next week, the Bible study on Esther will not be available until Tuesday. Normally, I try to have this ready by Monday evening, at least by 7 o'clock, but next week it will be Tuesday, so just wanted to let you know. Of course, once it's up on YouTube, it's always there. But for those of you that do like to look at it on Monday night, it will be Tuesday of next week before it is available. When we left Esther last week, her cousin Haman had contacted her and let her know about this evil plot that Haman, the despicable Haman, wanted to get rid of all of the Jews. And Mordecai now wants Esther to go into the presence of the king, King Xerxes. And of course, as Esther pointed out, if you're not invited and you walk into the presence of the king, it could mean death. So she had to ponder this request by Mordecai, whether she was willing to risk her life to intercede, to save the Jewish people. But if you look at the 4th chapter, the 14th verse, it's one of the most significant verses in the Hebrew Bible. For Mordecai said, "Who knows? Who knows? Whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Who knows whether you have become the queen for such a time as this? Before we talk about such a time as this, let's pause and pray together. Dear God, we thank you today for your loving kindness, for your mercy, and for your grace. As we open the pages of the ancient book of Esther, we can see your hand. Even though you're never mentioned in that book, we can see your presence and your power. And we can see how you are working through two faithful servants, through Mordecai and through Esther. I pray that we would open our hearts and open our lives to allow you to work through us, to speak through us, and for your presence to become a witness to others through our lives. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. You know, there's a Broadway musical called Hamilton that is very popular. Some of you may have seen it. You may have seen it on television. You certainly heard about Hamilton. There is a song, well, there are a bunch of songs in Hamilton, but there's one that if it gets in your head, you just can't get it out. The one I'm thinking about is "No one else was in the room where it happened." The room where it happened. Well, no one else was in the room where it happened when Esther and the king and Haman dined. Not once, but twice. We see it in the 5th chapter and we see it in the 7th chapter. No one else was in the room where it happened. But this is where everything begins to unfold. Now, in the Broadway musical Hamilton, let me tell you about that room where it happened, and let me tell you what was going on. There were 3 people having dinner in the book of Esther: the queen, the king, and Haman. In The Broadway musical Hamilton, it's talking about one of the most significant dinners in American history. It took place on a June night in 1790 in New York City. It was a dinner that was hosted by Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State to George Washington, and he invited two political rivals, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. No one else was in the room where it happened, but it would not be an exaggeration to say that that dinner may have saved the Union. It may have preserved the young nation from falling apart before it really got started. James Madison, as we all know, was the architect of the U.S. Constitution. But while the Constitution was being formulated and enacted, Thomas Jefferson was not involved because Thomas Jefferson was overseas as the minister to France. But when Thomas Jefferson returned now as the Secretary of State, he got in the middle of some battles, some serious battles that were going on as a result of that Constitution. The Constitution stipulated that there would be a seat of federal authority, a national capital, but it had not been specified where that capital would be. There were actually 16 potential locations that had been suggested. Most of these were in the North. James Madison, as we all know, was from Virginia. And the people from Virginia, the people from North Carolina, all the people from the South felt that if the new capital was going to be in the North, that they would lose a lot of their influence. And so they really wanted the capital to be in the South. But there was a second issue that was going on. And this is an interpretation of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, was a believer in a strong central authority. He felt like that more authority needed to be placed in the federal government than in the individual states. And as we well know, that's an argument that continues to this very day. Hamilton was convinced that the Constitution gave him the power as the Secretary of the Treasury to establish a national bank and to assume the debts from the Revolutionary War, which were very significant. The problem was you had some states, Virginia, for example, that had basically paid off their debt. You had other states, Massachusetts, for example, that was heavily in debt. And so the people in Virginia did not want to be responsible for the debts that other states, especially northern states, had taken on and they couldn't pay. They did not feel it was their responsibility to assume these debts. And so therefore this issue was called assumption. And they were at an impasse. Some of the Southern newspapers were even saying that they ought to dissolve the Union rather than pay the national debt. And so this was the dilemma that was going on. It was a big dilemma. It was already a division between the North and the South. And so one day, in June of 1790, Thomas Jefferson saw Alexander Hamilton. And he said, "I'd like to invite you to a dinner at my house." And then he invited James Madison. So he has these two men that are political rivals. James Madison wants to protect the interest of Virginia in the South. Alexander Hamilton wants to put more power into the federal government. And they had a dinner. It was a magnificent dinner. In fact, there's a book that has been written about this dinner. It's called Dinner at Mr. Jefferson's. 3 men, 5 great wines, and the evening that changed America. Because let me tell you what came out of that dinner. There was a compromise. The compromise was that Alexander Hamilton would support the new United States Capitol being in the South, and it was. Washington, D.C. was carved out of Virginia and Maryland. So now you have the capital that's in the South. In exchange, James Madison would support the assumption of the federal debt. It happened. The Union was preserved. And even to this day, there's a lot of power in the federal government, as we well know. And the United States Capitol is in the South, Washington, D.C. But it was only those 3 men. No one else was in the room where it happened. That is a great book, by the way. They have recipes. It was a complete menu of what was served that night. And it was, let me tell you, you talk about an extravagant dinner. Of course, Jefferson had just come back from France. He knew how to throw a grand dinner. And the courses that they served. But this book goes into detail about it has the menu, it even has the recipes, it lists all the different wines that were served at that dinner. But then it also talks about the importance of that dinner, the implications of that dinner, and how that dinner brought these 2 opposing views together and established the art of compromise, something that we desperately need in our government today. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about no one else was in the room where it happened in the book of Esther. So this drama, this great drama that is unfolding, it moves along so fast. Let me just go through chapters 5, 6, and 7 and tell you what is going on here. And you can read this in your Bible. But of course, Esther is preparing herself to go into the presence of the king's court, not knowing whether he will receive her or not. If he happens to be in a bad mood and he doesn't want to see her and she walks in, he could order her out, or he could even have her executed. But she goes into the king's throne room. And when he sees Queen Esther, he is delighted. He's so happy to see her. And he says to her, he said, "My queen, what is your desire? You tell me what you want, and it's yours, even if it's half of the kingdom." Wow. Yes, she picked a good time to go in and see the king. But instead of immediately saying, "This is what is going on," she said, "Well, if it pleases the king, let the king come with Haman to a private dinner that I have prepared." So the king says, "Get Haman at once. We're having dinner with the queen." So they had this magnificent dinner. No one else was in the room where it happened. But as the dinner went on with all of the magnificent food and the fine wines, finally the king said, "Now, what is it that you desire? What can I do for you? You tell me what you want. Anything you want. Your wish is my command, even if it's half of the kingdom." And then Esther says, "I'll tell you what I want. I want you and Haman to come to dinner again tomorrow night. Oh my, you talk about dramatic. And so they both said, absolutely, count on it, we'll be there. Haman leaves the palace and he's walking on cloud nine. He has never been any happier. First, the king has given him all of this authority. He has financial prosperity, he has wealth, he has a fine family, and now he dines privately with the king and the queen. He has everything except there's one man in the kingdom that really bothers him, and that is Mordecai. And Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. And so he's angry. We're going to talk about anger in just a few moments. But he's furious with Mordecai. And then he goes home and he's telling his wife, he said, I have all this, everything's going my way. Except there's one thing that just really, really bothers me. It's that guy Mordecai, that Jew, and he refuses to bow down to me, and I can't stand him. And his wife said, well, you can fix that. You've got all this power. Why don't you build a gallows? Make it the highest gallows in the whole world, 75 feet high. And Haman thought about it, and he said, that's a pretty good idea. You know what? That's what I'll do. And so that's where the 5th chapter ends. He says, tomorrow I'm going to hang Mordecai. Chapter 6. It's the night time. The king is having trouble sleeping. Maybe it was that big meal. Maybe he had heartburn. Maybe he had the hiccups. Don't know exactly what was going on, but he couldn't sleep. He couldn't sleep, and he orders his servants. He said, you know, there's a book. There's a book that records all of the great things that have been done for me. Bring me that book. Why don't you read to me from that book? Here's a little aside. When I was in seminary, I had a professor named Bob Dale. He was not only one of my favorite professors, but I actually served as a fellow under Bob Dale while I was in seminary. And he had a great influence on me. Well, Bob Dale told us one day, he said, I'm going to tell you something that would be good for you to do, a practice that you need to follow in your ministry. He said, I want you to get a file in your filing cabinet, back when that's what we did. He said, and label it stroke file. Because there are going to be times in your ministry where you're down and out and depressed, and you're going to be asking, is it worth it? But he said, whenever you get a letter or a card or a note in which somebody is thanking you for something you have done, or somebody's praising you, somebody is affirming you or encouraging you, put that letter in that file. And I did that for many, many years. I think I still have it. And I have letters that go back to the very beginning of my ministry. And there were times that I would go to that file and I would read the letters, and it certainly made me feel a lot better. And so the king couldn't sleep. So he has a file like this. And the servants come and they're reading the file. And one of the stories in here was how this man by the name of Mordecai had uncovered a plot to assassinate the king. And the king heard it, and he said, well, what did we do for this guy named Mordecai? How did we honor him? And the servant said, nothing. You never did a thing. He's never been honored. So the king decided it's time to honor this great man. And then he says, and now we're in the 6th chapter, It's in the 4th verse. He said, by the way, who's out there? And they said, oh, there's Haman. Haman's here. You see, Haman had come really, really early because he wanted to go before the king and to make sure the king was okay with him hanging Mordecai, who refused to bow down to him. But before he gets a chance to say anything to the king says to him, he said, what would you do if you really wanted to honor someone? What would be appropriate for the man who deserves the greatest honor? Well, old Haman, with all of his arrogance, and he feels like everything's about him. He's very narcissistic. He feels his self-importance. He's thinking, well, who would the king want to honor more than me? And so he's thinking this will be done for him. So he says, okay, this is what you do. You get a special robe and you put on this man. You put a royal crown on his head. You get a horse. And then you have one of the king's most noble princes to robe the man and to put him on his horse and to lead him around the city square, proclaiming, this is what was done for the man whom the king especially wants to honor. You go around leading the horse, praising this great man. And the king says, that is a fabulous idea. You know exactly what to do. Now I want you to go and do it. There's this fellow by the name of Mordecai, and I want you to do that for him. Oops. He had gallows 75 feet high built. He was getting ready to hang Mordecai. And now he has to go, and he has to put a robe on him. He has to put a crown on his head. He has to put him on a horse and lead him around the city, proclaiming what a great man he is. Sort of backfired on him, didn't it? We never see the name of God in this story, but can't you see how God is working? There are a couple of things. The rabbis have commentaries on all of this scripture, and they add a bunch of stuff. Whether you can depend on it or not, I don't really know. But the rabbis had a couple of other things. They also said that he had to bathe Mordecai, had to make sure he got a really good bath, and he had to cut his hair and trim his beard and do all of that, as well as put the robe and the crown on him. But the best part of the story the rabbis have is this. You see, the night before, Haman had come to his house. He had complained to his wife about Mordecai, and she's the one who said, well, why don't you build the gallows? Well, according to the rabbis, Haman has a daughter. And of course, she heard all of this. So the next day, when her daddy had left to go and take care of Mordecai to hang him, she hears his voice. And he's proclaiming this honor and all of this. And she says, she looks out the window and she sees what's going on, but she cannot really tell who is who. She is assuming that what her father did to humiliate Mordecai even more before the hanging was to have him to carry her father around on a great horse with a robe and a crown and to proclaim what a great man her father was. She goes and gets a chamber pot that has not been emptied. And when they walk by their house, she empties the chamber pot on the head of the one she assumes is Mordecai, not realizing that that was her father. Just a neat little touch to the story. And So after this, Haman it goes and tells his wife how humiliated he is. He may not have smelled real good either. And his wife said to him, "Let me tell you something, hubby. I think your luck has run out. You don't stand a chance against him." And while they were still talking, the king's servants came and said, "It's time for the second dinner with the queen." And now we go into the 7th chapter. The second dinner. No one else was in the room where it happened. And so what happens in the 7th chapter of Esther? They're having this wonderful meal once again. And in the middle of the meal, the king says to the Queen Esther, he said, "Tell me now, what is it that you want me to do for you?" And this is how she answered in the 3rd verse of the 7th chapter. "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, give me life and give my people their lives." We have been sold. I and my people are scheduled to be destroyed, to be massacred, to be eliminated. It's as if we've been sold off into slavery. I would have never brought this up. Our troubles maybe aren't even worth bothering you with. But the king exploded. There was fury. There was anger. And the king said, Who? Who is this evil person, this despicable person, this wicked man who would attempt to do something like this? And she said, "An enemy, an adversary. It is the evil Haman." Haman. Oh my goodness. You can imagine how he felt now. And so the king is so angry that he gets up and stalks out of the room in a rage. Meanwhile, Haman is pleading for his life with the queen. The queen apparently is on a couch or something like that. And Haman falls over on the couch. And about the time he falls over on the couch, the king walks back into the room and he thinks that Haman is about to seduce his wife or to take advantage of his wife, and he explodes even more. And about that time, one of his servants said, "Oh, by the way, king, there's a new gallows out there that has just been constructed. It's 75 feet high." The king said, "Hang him. Hang him on the gallows." That's exactly what they did. And the 7th chapter comes to an end. In the synagogues in Germany, at the beginning of the Third Reich, when the persecution had started against the Jews, at the Feast of Purim, when they would read the book of Esther, and when they would get to this point that the man who tried to annihilate, to eliminate, to exterminate the Jews was hanging on those gallows, people would cheer. And of course, if you missed the early session on Esther, we said that for the Jewish people in the Second World War, Haman is Hitler. Hitler becomes Haman. He has the same desire that Haman had, and that was to eliminate the Jewish people. Let me make a few comments about this. One is in the book of Esther. Do you see the role that anger and rage plays? Let me just point out all the different places in the book of Esther that we see this. The first is in the 1st chapter, the 12th verse, when Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's beck and call he's filled with rage. And then when the second chapter begins, in the first verse, it says, when his rage, when his anger had abated, when he had calmed down, he realized what he had done and he was having some second thoughts. In the third chapter of Esther, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down to him, he was filled with rage. And then in the fifth chapter, after the first dinner with the queen and the king, in that private dinner, Haman went out. He was so excited. But when Mordecai refused to bow down to him again, once again, it says he was filled with rage. And then in the seventh chapter, the seventh verse, the king was full of rage when he heard what Haman had done. And then he walks back in the room and Haman has fallen on the couch. Once again, he's full of rage. And so they decided that when they finally got around to hanging him in the 10th verse of the 7th chapter, finally that rage has abated. But it tells us about the anger and the rage that is so prominent in this book. And it tells us just about how powerful and dangerous anger can be. Let me share something else with you. You know, this story really speaks for itself. It's a great story. It's a great drama. But there's some other things going on. And I think this is really important for us to consider. There were 5 books called the 5 Scrolls. In Hebrew, it is the Hamesh Megillot. Hamesh 5 Megillot Scrolls. In the Hebrew Bible, these are placed together, and they're placed in a certain order for an important reason. The order is, number 1, the book of Ruth. Secondly, the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs. Thirdly, the one in the middle is Ecclesiastes, or they would say Koheleth. The 4th book is the book of Lamentations, and the 5th book is the book of Esther. So you have the book of Ruth at the beginning, and you have the book of Esther at the end. These 5 books, when considered together, tell us about many of the important things that make up our life. The book of Ruth focuses on kindness. The Song of Solomon on love. The book of Ecclesiastes on life, on the meaning of life. The book of Lamentations on loss. The book of Esther on justice. But since Ruth and Esther are bookends to the Hamesh Megillot, to the 5 scrolls, I think we can see some comparisons. Some we pointed out in one of the earlier studies. But think about this. Both Ruth and Esther have a primary character who has great power. In the book of Esther, of course, it's Haman. But in the book of Ruth, it's Boaz. But they use this power in totally different ways. Boaz uses his power to benefit others, to help others. He's pictured as someone who is kind and honest, compassionate, generous, and humble. In the book of Esther, you have Haman, who uses his power to destroy others. He is insecure. He's vindictive. He's arrogant. He's evil. And he uses his power to discredit others. to destroy other people. Haman would actually be laughable if he were not so dangerous. But somebody who is so pompous and so arrogant and so full of himself can be very dangerous. Power is seductive. And here you have two examples of a man who has power and he uses it in a redemptive way, and a man who has power and he uses it in a destructive way. The one big difference between Boaz and Haman is humility. Boaz comes across as a humble servant, even though he has all of this power. Haman comes across as one who has absolutely no humility at all. It's all about him. It's all self-serving. Everything that happens around him, he interprets it how it's going to benefit himself. Story time. So I'm in college, and we had a program when I went to Samford University, as many of you know. Now, Samford, back in the old days, used to be Howard College. My daddy actually went to school there when it was Howard College. When I would talk about this years ago in a Bible study, I could look at Polly Rollins, and Polly knew exactly what I was talking about because, you know, Polly grew up in Birmingham. And so she knew all about Howard and all about it. Then it becoming Samford University when Mr. Samford gave a lot of money, and that happens a lot. And so it was Samford University. But we had a program, the School of Religion was still the Howard College School of Religion. And so we had a program called H Day, H for Howard. And it had been going on for years and years, in which local churches and a local Baptist association would invite college students on a designated Sunday to come and to preach. And they would call it H Day. That's what the churches called it. We're going to have a college boy, a preacher boy is going to come and preach. I loved H Day. It was one of the best experiences that I had in college. I got as much of an education going out to preach at little churches on H Day as I did sitting in the classroom. And we would go to all kinds of churches. We'd go to First Baptist churches, but more frequently we'd go into small churches. Some of the churches didn't even have a full-time pastor. Some of the churches couldn't have had more than 24 people. There were large churches and there were small churches. There were churches that requested to make sure that this college student used the King James Bible. And they were also the short-haired churches. They didn't want, this was in the 70s. You remember the long hair? They didn't want any long-haired preacher. Those were the churches that we knew were very conservative. I always was selected to go to one of those churches because I normally always would carry a King James Bible, and you never had to worry about my hair. But it was such a good experience. I had a roommate one semester, and I say one semester, he only lasted one semester, not because of me, but he was the son of one of the most prominent Baptist ministers in the state of Alabama. And so his daddy was this great preacher that had all these positions of influence and power. And so he thought that's what he would do. So he went to college, and he's going to be a preacher just like his daddy. But he never went on H Day with us. And there was one Saturday where the students had already been assigned to the churches, and one of the students got sick. And he let the leaders know that I'm not going to be able to go. And so it's like, is there anybody else that could go and preach? And I noticed my roommate had never been on an H day. And so I went to him. I said, Mark, we need another preacher tomorrow. Why don't you go? You've never been on H day. And I'll never forget what he said. He looked at me and said, I don't need to go. I'm not going to go to those hick churches. He said, my daddy is the pastor of one of the largest churches in the state. And he can get me in any pulpit in this state anytime he wants to. Which was a crazy statement to make. His father couldn't have done that. But that was the way he felt about it. I'm going to tell you something else. Maybe we'll go back and take this out of the Bible study. But I always worried about that boy because, here's this guy, I didn't even know him. He's my roommate. I noticed that boy had purple underwear. Now, folks, this is back in the 70s. I know today you get all different color underwear. But back then, nobody wore purple underwear that I knew. I didn't even know they made purple underwear for guys. So I was a little bit suspicious of him from the very beginning. But when he told me, I'm not going to go to those hick churches, it told me something about his character. And by the way, he only lasted one semester. And at one point, he never went into the ministry, by the way. And that was a good thing. Because he didn't have the right attitude. He was somebody that was arrogant and pompous and felt his own importance. Jesus said, the greatest among you will be your servants. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. One more thing before we go. God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. But can't you see God is here? Do you think there was a reason that the king couldn't sleep that night and said, bring me the book, read about all the good things that have happened? You think that just happened? There's so many times in our life when something happens and we don't understand it, and we look back and we say, I think God was directing the drama the whole time. No one else was in the room where it happened. But God was there. God was there from the very beginning of Esther to the very end. And God is always with us. So next week, we will continue with the book of Esther. And by the way, one reminder, next week, it will be posted by Tuesday night rather than Monday night. I hope you have a great week. It looks like we have a little colder weather. At least if you're watching this later on, I'm filming this on the second day of November. And the weather turned cold last night. But it's November. It's time. So I hope you have a great, great day. God bless. And I hope to see you next time as we continue the study on the book of Esther.